Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. John Lennon. DZ Tribe, Josh Thomas, I'm so glad to have you here. Doing a special episode of the Do Zone podcast from Medellin, Colombia. I'm sitting on a patio overlooking the city from a hill. There's a river in the background that's flowing water. It's really nice. It's beautiful. It's a nice temperature. The people are so nice. But some things aren't so nice. And I want to talk about that today. But first, before I do that, I want to make sure if you do like this podcast, please subscribe, follow on Apple and or Spotify. And just a reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Unbreakable Teams. And what Unbreakable Teams is it's a fractional COO service where we focus on building and nurturing and growing teams so that you can scale your business without additional cost and without additional time and effort on your part. And you don't have to micromanage your teams. If that's interesting to you, I invite you to go to unbreakableteams.com to learn more and see if it might be a fit. One more time, that's unbreakableteams.com. So back to the point. I'm sitting here overlooking one of the coolest cities in Colombia. I'm up on a hill. I'm in this giant house with a bunch of friends. And I went down this morning to have breakfast in a very gringo part of town that's called Parquejeras. And in Parquejeras, I probably did not see so many Americans anywhere else in the city. But I went to sit down at this restaurant and like everybody was speaking English. Everybody had blonde hair and was complaining about their problems back home or whatever. So it was interesting. But one thing that really stood out to me as I was sitting there eating this breakfast is there was a guy sitting right outside on the sidewalk, right outside of the entrance. It was mostly a patio, so he was right next to everybody. He was holding some like bubblegum lollipops, and he had those in his hand, and then he had a little note. And I didn't really see what the note said, but it probably said something like, tough times, and need a little help, something like that. And he was not aggressive. He wasn't asking for help, and he wasn't bothering anyone. He was just sitting there with 5 or 6 lollipops in his hand and a little sign. And you could tell that he was sitting there because he wanted somebody to give him money, or he wanted to sell these lollipops and get some money. Just to set the stage, the typical salary here in Medellin is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $500 a month. That's where like most people that have full-time jobs that are unskilled labor, they're making about that much. Not very much money at all. Now it is cheap to live here, but it's not that cheap. So he's sitting here, and I sat down to eat breakfast, and everything in Colombia takes forever, and so it took like 20-30 minutes for the breakfast to come out. He's still sitting there, and I noticed when I was waiting on the food, I noticed that he was crying. And he was making this face where you could just tell that there was so much pain. And he's sitting here holding these 5 lollipops with a little sign in one hand and wiping his tears with another hand and just looking around in this desperation state. And it really made me feel for him. I had these feelings, and I was just like, man, how bad does your life have to be in order for you to have to sit down in front of a restaurant full of gringos with some lollipops, hoping that somebody will take pity on you enough to buy one so that you have some money? And at least that's what I thought at first. And so I sat there, the food came, food was fine, started eating it, and then I had to make a call. I had my morning meeting with my team, and this was a reasonably quiet place, and my signal was strong, so I went ahead and had the meeting there. And this guy was right in my line of sight the whole time, and he was still crying. Like, I ate breakfast, and he was still crying. I had my meeting, and he was still crying. I finished my meeting, and he was still crying. I was probably sitting here for almost 2 hours, and the guy kept doing the same thing over and over, But one thing I didn't see was tears. When you see somebody that's in this state of heightened stress and they're so desperate that they're crying, that's usually a temporary situation. Your brain is trying to release some kind of stress or tension, and you're going to cry. And that helps present some new chemicals into your brain that kind of relax you and bring you down a little bit. But it doesn't make sense for somebody to be sitting there for 2 hours in the same position. He never moved. He never stood up. He never kind of like adjusted himself, but he was just crying and looking around. But he wasn't actually crying. He was faking it. He was faking it because he knew that it would create that reaction that I had initially when I first saw him. And he had the benefit of being in an area that was fairly transient. Nobody was really spending much time there. I just happened to be sitting in his line of sight for an hour and a half, and I saw the whole thing unfold. But if I was just passing by and I saw a guy holding some lollipops, I wouldn't stop. But if I was passing by and I saw some guy holding some lollipops and he was crying, well, that's different. Man. And it made me think about all the things that I just told you I thought about. And that's when I realized that he was just doing that to get pity and attention. And at one point, there was somebody that stopped because they hadn't seen him fake crying for the last hour. They stopped and they spent some time with him and bought one of his lollipops, and he sat there and pretended to cry some more. And then they left and they went on and he started crying again.